Affairs Committee. But before that, we have a preeminent expert to discuss really what she thinks is going on in the Middle East and what the ramifications of the president's Syrian policy are for the United States. I'm thrilled to welcome none other than Judy Miller. I was going to say, pardon me, Judy, who is a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She and I appear time to time together on the A Block on Fox Business and Lou Dobbs' show. And I like to say, once a journalist, always a journalist. Judy also was privileged to be part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for their reporting on the global war on terrorism. Without further ado, it's my honor to welcome Judy Miller to the program. Judy, how are you?
I'm fine, Ron. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Unpack this for us, will you? I just find such a difficult time trying to find a coherent American foreign policy and a coherent American objective as it relates to Syria. What's your take on this?
Well, I'm afraid it's not that you're wearing blinders or rose-colored glasses. You're looking for something that simply doesn't exist. I think that by anyone's standard, Barack Obama has made quite a mess out of this Syria policy. And now he's made the kind of mess that he's asking American credibility at home and abroad to pay for. And I think that Americans have expected more of him because he is an extremely intelligent man. But on this Syria policy, he has just utterly been playing it by ear in an impromptu fashion, reversing himself, undercutting his Secretary of State and his very eloquent statement last Friday about the need for action, saying that we were going to go it alone, then deciding we weren't going to go it alone, that he was going to go to the Congress, while all the while saying he might still act even if Congress turns him down. Now, if anyone can find a coherent strategy in all of this, you're a far better analyst than I.
And I think that's precisely right. And you've said so many things that I want to get in a little bit greater detail with. What do you think it does to Secretary Kerry's credibility with his counterparts around the world when he came out, as you pointed out, so forcefully last Friday and made a very impassioned plea for the use of military force just after Great Britain and the House of Commons elected not to take that route? And then he was undercut the following day by the President of the United States that said, well, wait a second, we actually do have a little bit more time and we'll wait for the Congress to come back on September the 9th. What do you think that does for Secretary Kerry's credibility around the world?
You know, I was really astonished because I hadn't been expecting, as you pointed out, quite an eloquent a statement and articulation of what the United States had at stake if it did nothing in response to the massive use of chemical weapons, probably sarin, probably by the Assad government. And I don't think you could have gotten a better formulation of what was at stake and why America had to act than the one that Secretary Kerry offered. And to have to be so totally thrown under the bus the very next day, I mean, I think had it been many other people who were perhaps not as long-suffering as former Senator, now Secretary of State Kerry, they would have quit. And some people, in fact, analysts even called for him to quit. But instead, Secretary Kerry pulled up his socks and licked his wounds, which must have been many.
Yes.
And, got back into the fray. And the very next day, he was on Capitol Hill unveiling what he called intelligence information indicating that sarin had been used by Syrian government forces. So he is playing the good soldier. He's saluting. If this is the president's decision, he's going to go with it. But clearly, you can kind of see by the testiness of his testimony up on the Hill that this has to be a kind of a slight humiliation for him and a difficult moment for him.
I'm curious, whether folks agreed with him or not, there was a clear articulation of what the Bush doctrine was. That is, if you harbored a terrorist or if you were harboring state sponsors of terrorism around the world, you knew that the Bush administration would deal very decisively with that. Based on what we've seen with Syria and the president's overarching Middle East strategy or lack thereof, is there something that you believe we can call the Obama doctrine?
I think you'd have to call it an evacuation doctrine, or as one analyst called it, the Garbo doctrine. I just want to be alone. I mean, it is truly bewildering. I mean, this is a man who said that he was going to get us out of the Middle East, but everything he's done since he came into office and now in the second term lays the groundwork for an eventual forced American response that will be greater or as great as any that we've had in recent years. I mean, if Assad is not frightened away from using chemicals, but if he uses them again, if this war spreads across into Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, even more than it already has, if the chemicals are raided by Jabhat al-Nusra or the other al-Qaeda-aligned groups that are operating in the north and of Syria, and they are threatening to be used against Israel or other allies. If the Iranians decide that Obama has no stomach for military action, significant military action, and that they can go on their merry way on their centrifuge program, modernization, upgrade, expansion, and plutonium course, then all of that suggests that eventually the United States will have to intervene in a much more dramatic and perhaps much bloodier way than it would have been, than we would have had to if we had done things earlier on, such as identify rebel groups that shared American and Western values, shared a commitment to a secular Syria that was inclusive, I'm not going to say democratic, but inclusive of its many, many ethnic and religious groups. If we had picked out the likely strong horse and started working with them, we might have been able to make a difference. I'm not even sure about that, by the way, Ron, but at least there are a great many things we could have done that we didn't do because President Obama was in full evacuation mode from the Middle East. Now, I can't blame him in that I understand that Americans are sick unto death of this extended involvement and stay in the Middle East. It has not worked out well for us, so we think. I think, history, you have to wait a little time to see how this plays out. And it isn't Obama's fault that the Arab Spring came along and totally upended and dislodged America's most dependable, long-standing allies in the region, even if they happen to be dictators. But the way in which he has responded to the Arab Spring, which has also been to kind of step back and try to be neutral, except when he goes into Libya, a whole hog, without the Congress, by the way. Now he's going to seek congressional permission, but in Libya he didn't bother.
Yeah.
And that was a much larger and longer commitment involving $1 billion, and we've wound up with a country whose government doesn't even control its second largest city, and the death of an American ambassador and 3 other Americans serving there. So I'm not sure that even in his ad hoc response to the Arab Spring, there is a coherent strategy or a set of tactics or things that he's decided to do or won't do. It's just kind of play it by ear foreign policy, and it's making a great many American allies all over the world nervous.
And that's what worries me, Judy. We have only a couple minutes left to go, but I have to say, if you look at what President Obama promised before he became president, he said that we were going to be liked again, that his election was going to do much to burnish the American reputation that apparently had been so tarnished by the Bush administration. But now we find, of course, that America is held in lower regard and lower esteem now than the Bush administration. But my question to you here is this. I'm worried that this is more of a proxy conflict dealing with Syria. We know that Iran has been very supportive of Syria in the past, and I wonder whether or not Iran's attempts not only to destabilize Syria, but looking at our allies, Jordan, looking at the sectarian conflict that's going on in Iraq, looking at what's going on in Afghanistan, do you find that we're in a more precarious place now in the Middle East than we were before President Obama came into office?
Well, I think we are in a more precarious situation, but it's partly because of the Arab Spring. I had the good luck or bad luck, depending on how you look at it, to be in Egypt when the Arab Spring really began there, and I stuck with it, and I've been back several times. And Egypt, of course, is the ball game. It is the largest single Arab country. It is the linchpin of peace with Israel. It is 90 million people and the oldest American ally, dependable ally in terms of working with Israel. And I don't think that there's anything that Barack Obama could have done to stop what happened, but I think he might have tried to help engineer a more graceful exit for President Hosni Mubarak, who was a long-standing American ally and friend. And the fact that that didn't happen, once again, raised a lot of questions about the reliability and dependability of the United States in a crunch. So I think we were a marginal player in this great drama that's been unfolding in the Middle East, but we were not an insignificant one. And yet, what President Obama has done now is I think, project an image of fecklessness, of indecisiveness, of a kind of we didn't really want to do this, but now we have to tactic. And I'm very worried about how that will be seen among our friends and our enemies.
So looking forward, trying to find something positive about this, because I'm a glasses half full type of optimist, Judy, as opposed to the pessimist. Is there any course of action that if you were the Secretary of State or if you had the opportunity to advise President Obama, what course of action would you urge the president to do to not only try to restore our credibility around the world, but to make sure that what looks to be a regional conflict doesn't really blow up on us and then turn into a more broader problem for the Middle East as it pertains to Syria? What would you tell him? What sort of advice would you render?
Well, I tell him what not to do.
Yeah.
I tell him not to declare that you want President Assad to leave office immediately and then say that you favor a diplomatic, negotiated solution to the crisis. I mean, if you've already taken a side, you can hardly be seen as an objective or a neutral arbiter. So we took ourselves out of that game. You can not make spontaneous, off-the-cuff, red-line declarations that commit us to doing something significant about the use of chemical weapons and then do nothing after you've drawn that line, because no one will go with you, or the Congress opposes, or the American people are not in favor. He can stop creating boxes that make his own policy choices more limited and outcomes more questionable. He can start by not making things worse, by observing the doctor's motto, do no harm. And let's just start with that. He can start by explaining to the American people what his strategy for making things better in Syria is, and just a shot across the bow. It just defies, I think a lot of Americans are just mystified as to how that's going to achieve American objectives in the region. Even Americans who favor normally the projection of force have trouble with a kind of whimsical use of force that seems not tied to any American broader strategy for how to ensure that, quote, the good guys, if there are any, or the less bad guys, prevail in what is a very bloody, protracted civil war.
Judy Miller, thank you so very much. I think we've all learned a lot from your insights and your wisdom, and we look forward to the opportunity to talk with you again here on the Steve Malzberg Show.
Very, very nice to talk to you, Ron.
Always a pleasure. Thank you. Take care.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye. That was Judy Miller, a fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a 2002 Pulitzer Prize winner. Coming up next after the break, we have Congressman Scott Perry, a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. He's going to talk about testimony on Capitol Hill today and what the mood is on Capitol Hill as it regards the use of the authorization of military force. I'm Ron Christie, sitting in for Steve Malzberg. We'll be back in just a few minutes.